All right. We are beginning Song of Solomon chapter 6. Song of Solomon chapter 6. We should only have maybe another, after this one, another 2 classes or so to finish out Song of Solomon. So next Wednesday night, I'll go ahead and have the Ecclesiastes notes out on the back table. So last week we finished chapter 5. Chapter 5 is kind of a graphic expression of the wedding night. And at the end of chapter 5, we noted the mindset of the Shulamite girl, how that she was in despair, this emotional turmoil that she was dealing with because of what she had lost. And the daughters of Jerusalem, when she is asking the chorus in the song here, the daughters of Jerusalem, if you see my loved one, tell him I'm lovesick, and she's hurting. And the daughters of Jerusalem say, well, hold on, before we go trying to find him, who is this fella of yours? And so at the end of chapter 5, she describes him, and then is reminded of the fact that not only is he her beloved, he's her friend. And so it brings back to her recognition and her understanding that this is why she married him in the first place. That yes, this was worth it. Yes, this was something that was special. And here in chapter 6 and in verse 1, they come back to this after she finishes this recognition at the end of chapter 5. The daughters of Jerusalem ask her the second question. Where has your beloved gone, O fairest among women? Where has your beloved turned aside that we may seek him with you? You're trying to find him. We'll help you now. Okay, now that she's come to this realization. And of course, to read this literally makes it very difficult trying to piece together what happens in chapter 5, and then for chapter 6, for her to say, he's here with me. Okay, he never physically left. And I wouldn't even say that there was anything, that he did anything bad or wrong in the sense that he was emotionally detached or anything like that. This was simply a situation that he couldn't relate to her in this issue. And so here in verse 2, she speaks again. She says, my beloved has gone to his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed in the gardens and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He feeds among the lilies. And again, his flock, that's italicized, that's put in by man, but it's an attempt to relate it earlier to chapter 1 and chapter 2, this pastoral language, describing him as a shepherd. But really, this is more of a connection to chapter 3, where he himself describes himself as a gazelle, seeking to dance and so forth. And there's this recognition when he is inviting her to come with him of eating among the orchards and so forth. This is what she's describing. This is this relationship that they have, that it has the emotional attachment, but also the physical attachment as well. And so this is still a representation of the marriage bed here in verses 2 and in verse 3. Anything through verse 3. So when she says, he's here. But now I have a better appreciation, I'm not in as much turmoil as I was. And again, keep in mind, Solomon is writing all of this. And again, whether this was somebody's actual, maybe his favorite wife's actual thoughts that she shared with him, and he wrote down this song as a result, or he had in his wisdom the insight to appreciate this type of situation. Okay, again, to me, an even further poignant purpose of the song, if indeed Solomon didn't have, in reality, this type of relationship, it's really a sad song in that Solomon, he wishes he could have had this. He wishes he could have had such a relationship, but he didn't, if that was the case. But the insight that he had into what a type of relationship would be like and what the mindset of the woman would be is again, that goes back to the wisdom that he had, and I think to a certain degree the sensitivity that Solomon had. Really, you think about Proverbs, you think about Ecclesiastes, you think about the wisdom that he showed, but you didn't really get a sense of sensitivity. And really, when you think about Solomon and all the wives and concubines that he had, you wouldn't really necessarily, I mean, this might be just a Western frame of mind, but you wouldn't necessarily attribute to him a romantic sensitivity. But the Song of Solomon reveals he did have a romantic sensitivity, whether it was based in the fact that he was in a relationship like this or that he wished he was in a relationship like this. So, here in verse 4, he speaks once again. Okay, so he's still there with her, and he's talking to her. And so when she describes the fact that he's here, he's always been there, and she recognizes that she doesn't need to be in such sorrow and turmoil over the fact that she's lost the state of being a virgin of one of the daughters of Jerusalem. So in verse 4, the beloved speaks, and again, remember our pronouns here helps us to understand who's speaking and when. There are a few times where, as we covered a couple weeks ago, where there might be certain points where the chorus may cut in, which might help us to better understand it, like earlier in chapter 5. But here in chapter 6, here in verse 4, Solomon speaks and says, "O my love, you are as beautiful as Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners." And of course, that phrase awesome, we have a modern definition of awesome, but what did awesome literally mean? We use awesome to say, man, that's cool. But what did awesome really mean?
Something you're in awe of.
Something
that's more than just cool.
Something that actually provokes awe. Okay? Awe-inspiring is what we would probably say today. And that is what Solomon is referring to his love as here in verse 4. Tirzah, does anybody recognize that the name of that city? Notice it's connected with lovely as Jerusalem. Tirzah, does anybody recognize that the name of that city? Right, right. When we go back to, let's see, 1 Kings, chapter 14 and in verse 17, chapter 15 and in verse 33, Tirzah is mentioned. But it also, this is one of those context clues that helps us to not only date it, but also to reinforce the fact that Solomon has indeed written this. Tirzah wasn't always a great, splendor, awesome city. Okay, Jerusalem, for the most part, remained the capital for, as long as, for Judah, for all the whole time. But Tirzah, it was a magnificent city for a set period of time. And then after a while, it just kind of was completely forgotten. And so it helps to not only recognize the time scale that we're dealing with, but to recognize that it's a very specific time scale while Tirzah was in its prime. And of course, that was during the reign of Solomon. He says, awesome as an army with banners. And of course, he's describing her as awe-inspiring. And of course, from a man's point of view, especially from Solomon, the king's point of view, the idea of something that is awe-inspiring, and really, I don't know that you and I could appreciate it as Solomon could. Okay? We don't have the ability to go out and command tens of thousands of soldiers to stand and hold up banners. But if we could, imagine how awesome that would look. Okay? How awe-inspiring that would be to see tens of thousands of soldiers, with banners held up, marching perhaps in unison, that sort of thing. That's impressive to think about. And this is how he's relaying his feeling of awe. And it's something he can relate to. Verse 5, turn your eyes away from me, for they have overcome me. Your hair is like a flock of goats going down from Gilead. So we have, in some ways, repetition from what he has described of her before, and this recognition of what she's like. Notice that despite the fact that here in chapter 5, they have experienced this wedding night, And now this seems to be the next day. But after that event here in verse 5, he still sees her exactly the same. Okay, nothing has changed on his end. It kind of compares to Amnon and Tamar when he raped Tamar. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, his hatred of her was even greater than his former desire for her. And so this is kind of a stark contrast, that this wasn't some malicious motivation on Solomon's part. It continues to be his care and his love for her continues to be just as strong as it always has been. And that's why verse 5 again describes that intoxicating nature of when she looks at him, kind of his heart melts type of thing. Her hair as being something he kind of perceives as being flowing and beautiful. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep which have come up from the washing. Everyone bears twins. She still has all her teeth. None is barren among them. Verse 7, like a piece of pomegranate are your temples behind your veil. All of this describes or is really a repetition of how he described her before. Okay, so really verse 5 on through verse 7 is just kind of a redoubling of that impression that he still has of her. Anything through verse 7. Verse 8. There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The daughters saw her and called her blessed, the queens and the concubines, and they praised her. So here in verse 8, there are, for example, commentator, not Zer, 2 R's though, Carr, suggests that here in verse 8 that this is literal numbers, which would really kind of almost exactly place it at a certain point in Solomon's reign when he literally had 60 wives and 80 concubines. It's possible that that's the case. It seems unlikely that given the metaphorical and symbolic nature of so much of what he's been describing, that the 60 and the 80 are specific. It's possible, but more likely it's the idea that despite, especially the increasing numbers, the 60 queens, the 80 concubines, and the virgins without number, with all of these, doesn't matter how many women you throw out there, this one is the perfect one. Okay, this is this re-emphasizing the fact that this one is the one he's chosen, that he has this special relationship with. And so when he says, my dove, my perfect one, is the only one, and he says, the only one of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. Well, if she was an only child, or for that matter, an only daughter, she's the only one of the one who bore her. But he says, the favorite of the one who bore her. And so what he's describing is not so much that he's saying you should pick your favorite children. That's not the concept. But it's the idea that she kind of engenders herself to everybody she meets, is the idea. That everybody who knows her loves her. The daughters saw her and called her blessed. Okay, these are the daughters of Jerusalem, the queens and the concubines. Notice how it goes in reverse from verse 8. The virgins without number, the 80 concubines and queens, it goes the reverse way here. They call her blessed. The virgins do. The queens and the concubines, they praised her. And so even these individuals who, in theory, could have had reason to be jealous or envious of this relationship that she and Solomon share, they love her. Okay, they call her blessed. And so this speaks not so much, again, he deals with verses 3 through 7 or so with her appearance and how it makes him feel. And that's really the point, is how it makes him feel. It's not, so much literal appearance. And then verses 8 on through verse 9 really describes her personality, or at least the effect of her personality on others. The fact that she engenders herself to people. It causes her to feel, or causes them to feel like they can trust her. You would assume trustworthiness, and honesty about her, kindness, and of course she's been described as all these things before anyway. And again, the mention of her being a dove, verse 9, again carries with it that peaceful sense of presence. Okay? And so in verse 9, when the daughters and the queens and the concubines, they see her, they praise her, and they bless her. And then verse 10, I know again in my digital Bible here, man has included where he thinks the different parts are, but it seems as though verse 10 is kind of breaking from verse 9, where the daughter saw her and call her blessed. The queens and concubines, they praise her, and then verse 10 is actually them doing that. Okay, so verse 10 sounds as if it's actually the chorus speaking here. We talked about the chorus as being the daughters of Jerusalem. At times, it could be all of the, I don't even know what you would call all of them, the wives, the concubines, and the virgins all together. But that's what verse 10 would be. And we'll get to verse 10 here in a second. So anything through verse 9? All right, verse 10. Who is she who looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? Again, in this, whoever put in these headings, whoever added these things in here, not Solomon, but man did in the digitizing of this Bible or whatnot, there's no attribution, verse 10, to anyone but Solomon. But for Solomon to say, it doesn't really necessarily fit. It could be rhetorical, and that's the only way it could be meant by what Solomon says. Remember, Solomon is there with her. He and the Shulamite girl are there together. And they still are acknowledging their feelings for one another. And so here in verse 10, who is she who looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? It doesn't really fit even in a rhetorical way for him to be making this statement. It seems to fit better for it to be the virgins and the queens and the concubines who are praising and blessing her in verse 10. Okay? So notice how it seems as though they're perceiving the change in her. She looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun. And this stands in contrast to how she describes herself earlier in the Song of Solomon. Okay, don't condemn me or judge me for the fact that my skin is dark, because I have been working in the fields. I've had to work for my family. And then they're contrasting the fact that in that situation it represented status. Remember, we talked about that? And the fact that didn't bother Solomon. Well, the queens and the concubines and the virgins, they're acknowledging her. The way they describe her is in contrast to this servant girl or this worker in the fields. Well, now look what she's become. Okay, look how she's different now. It's not that her skin changed or anything else. It's that you could almost say their perception of her has changed in a way. Or at the very least, the fact that now that she is wife to Solomon, and there's even some commentators that suggest her countenance and her bearing now that she's actually married to Solomon, whereas before, she was anxious about it, and she loved him and so forth, and she was anxious to be with him, and now she's married, and this contentedness takes hold. That might be there, it may not, but particularly, it does seem as if it's the perspective, how they perceive her as being different than she was before. Thoughts through verse 10?
It wouldn't make much sense for Solomon to say, who is this that's awesome as an army of banners, when he's already said that a while back. Second chapter.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And that's why I was kind of curious when I was reading through this and I saw that the attribution didn't change there between verse 9 and verse 10. So, they think Solomon's saying this, where it seems as though verse 10, it's actually the chorus speaking here. Whoever put these headings in here in my Bible, I don't know, in some of your Bibles y'all might have these headings. Does anybody have something different there for chapter 10? The the American Standard might, because it seems like Lisa's Bible seems to have different attributions at certain points, or at least that one back in chapter 4 that we talked about seem to have a different attribution.
One doesn't have a header, but on verse 9 it says, and they praised her, saying.
Saying. Okay, so that's an implied attribution. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Which Bible is that? New American. Okay. Yeah. I think the American Standard has a little bit more specific attributions that it provides there. Anything else through verse 10? All right, verse 11. So then the Shulamite girl speaks up again here in verse 11. She says, I went down to the garden of nuts to see the verdure of the valley, to see whether the vine had budded and the pomegranates had bloomed. The verdure, what is the verdure of the valley? Anybody know that term? Blossoms or growth. Okay, and of course that you can kind of see to see whether the vine had budded, the pomegranates. Do you remember how Solomon described this quote unquote season earlier, back in was it chapter 3, where he was inviting her to come with him? You remember how he described that? And we attributed the season he was describing to spring. You know, how that the vines were producing grapes and everything was lush and everything was being kind of born again, so to speak, in the spring. That's kind of how things work. That is the recognition he invited her before. Well, now she says, I went down. Okay? That invitation has now been concluded. And of course, that represents the wedding and, of course, the wedding night. She's describing the fact that this has all now happened. I went down to the garden of nuts to see the verdure of the valley. That this, indeed, this season, so to speak, the season of spring, or more specifically, the season of love. Yes, it has produced. To see whether the vine had budded, the pomegranates had bloomed. Before I was even aware, my soul had made me as the chariots of my noble people. This is an interesting phrase in the Hebrew. In fact, anybody who has American Standard, New American Standard, what does verse 12 say for you?
Before I was seen.
Verse 12?
The whole thing?
Yeah.
That before I was aware, my soul set me over the chariots of my noble people.
Yeah. The way it's phrased in a way that is, she has found herself exalted. Not that she has exalted herself, but that she has been exalted. And the sense of it is, before, she was just a Shulamite girl, a servant girl, that Solomon found that he loved. Well, now that he's married her, now look what she is. And that really goes back to verse 10 as well. Who is she who looks forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? Now she has accepted the invitation. Solomon wanted to marry her. She married him. And now, before she even, it's almost like she's saying, before I knew it, look, this is where I was. This is the position I was in. My soul had made me as the chariots of my noble people, or set me over the chariots of my noble people. And I do think that is speaking from her perception of the change, okay? Just as the chorus noted her change, which stands in contrast to how Solomon saw her. Had Solomon seen her change at all? He describes her exactly the same way, doesn't he? And to me, that's almost a beautiful point, that Solomon sees her exactly the same way as he did before. But the daughters of Jerusalem see her differently. She sees herself differently. Verse 12, before I even knew it, this is the state, this is the position I'm in. I don't think there's anything sexual about verse 12. Okay, some people seem to try to make an effort to connect it to verse 11. Well, it is connected to verse 11 in that verse 11 represents her accepting and going through with the marriage and, of course, the wedding night. And now verse 12, this is the position I'm in. And there is a change. But as far as Solomon's concerned, nothing's different. He sees her just as beautiful and wonderful now as he did before. Anything through verse 12? All right. I did want to mention, let's see here. There's something that Garrett mentioned in here that I wanted to bring out. Yeah. So for verse 12, this verse is highly obscure, as a perusal of translations will readily disclose. Working with a minimal amount of emendation, a possible rendition is, I am beside myself, you have set me among the chariots, a prince is with me. The change of person from second to third, you and a prince, is not unusual, as in chapter 1, verse 4. The meaning is that she is overwhelmed by all that has happened to her. To be set among the chariots, she likens her beloved to a prince. The point is that she's about to leave the Jerusalem girls behind once and for all and entering into married life. And the interpretation is sustained by the following verse, which comes into chapter 13, where the chorus comes back to speaking there in verse 13. So anything else through verse 12? All right. So this says the beloved and his friends. I don't know why that's there. Nothing in this, well, I say that. Nothing in this, unless they're connecting it somehow because they think Solomon's speaking in verse 10, that for some reason that means he and his friends are speaking in verse 13. I don't know. Just ignore the beloved and his friends, because I don't think that's accurate. I think this is the chorus. Okay, because there is a sense in which she has now changed. The chorus acknowledged that. She has acknowledged that. And then it says, verse 13, return, O Shulamite, return, that we may look upon you. There is a sense in which this I think King James and maybe American Standard says that we may gaze upon you. It is interesting because the Hebrew of this does have a masculine tense. But basically what that would be saying is, in essence, Solomon wants to parade you around for everybody to look at you, would be the implication. But the use of, and this is what Garrett says, the use of the masculine form, you gaze, does not mean that a group of men is addressed, since the song does not adhere to the strict grammatical convention in this regard. Now, the pronouns, it does. But the usage of these verbs and so forth, it's not specific there. And that's why it wouldn't fit. And besides, the way Solomon sees her and so forth, that would not fit. In fact, there was actually something else I think he said. Let's see. Yeah, so I think the American Standard has, why would you gaze on the Shulamite as on the dance of the Mahanaim? Does anybody have that in their translation? I think that's American Standard or King James maybe. It's kind of a weird phrasing. The meaning of Mahanaim is uncertain. It could be taken either as the proper name of the village that is mentioned in Genesis chapter 32, that the NIV makes that implication, or as the meaning of two groups when we get here to verse 13. That's the second part of verse 13. What would you see in the Shulamite as it were the dance of the two groups? Okay. It sounds as if the chorus is return, O Shulamite, return that we may look upon you. They've acknowledged the fact that she is looking forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, awesome, and so forth. It's not that they don't want her to be his wife. Okay, that's not to be read as envy or jealousy. It's simply an expression of that awe. Okay, we want to look upon you. We want to see this glory that you now have. And in fact, that's what she notices there, or the Shulamite girl acknowledges in verse 12. I've changed because I'm now in this position, and she sees herself differently as a result. Verse 13, the chorus wants to gaze upon her. What would you see in the Shulamite as it were the dance of the two camps? And that's where Garrett is describing this term, this phrase, or Hebrew term, Mahanaim. Either way, it would refer to the name of some dance known to the ancient Israelites, but now lost to us. Fox, who's one of the commentators he mentions on several occasions, makes the attractive suggestion that the lines mean, why would you gaze at the perfect one as if she were a camp dancer? Whichever interpretation is preferred, the meaning is that the Jerusalem girls would not stare at her or try to keep her to themselves as if she were some kind of entertainment. The text does not imply that anyone is actually dancing. So from the general description of the woman in the admiration song, this is describing this, really it's almost in a way describing the changed nature from what she was to what she is now. Okay, so when she says, the chorus says, "Return, return, O Shulamite, return that we may look upon you," it would appear that she responds, "What would you see in the Shulamite? As it were the dance of the two camps." It's not that she's saying, "What, you just want me to entertain you." It's that acknowledgement that there is a change now. You don't see me as you did before. And it's almost a kind of a sarcastic, rhetorical statement that she makes here. What would you see in the Shulamite? Well, they've already acknowledged what they see. They see in her as the morning, or fair as the moon, clear as the sun. She looks forth as the morning, awesome as with banners, as it were the dance of the two camps, as if she were a camp dancer. No, and that's the point, is that no, that's not what we would see. That's not how we see you. We see you this way. Okay? Now, again, different translations are going to attribute it differently to try to, and I've tried to kind of look at it the way this Bible sets it out. I can't make it fit. But then again, the attributions of these are really focused on the pronouns that are used. And in certain places, it can be either or, especially when you have the chorus in there kind of throwing the pronouns this way and that way. But I believe that this way makes the most sense to see this as verse 13. The chorus speaks, and the second half of verse 13, the woman speaks back to them in a rhetorical way. Because the answer is, no, that's not how we see you. We see the exaltation that Solomon has given you. We see the fact that you have this status with him. Thoughts or questions or ideas there in chapter 13, or verse 13 of chapter 6?
Mine just has a footnote that says the first part is the chorus and the second part is the bridegroom.
Bridegroom?
The bridegroom.
The ESV shows that it's Solomon.
Solomon speaking?
Is that the Solomon second part of 13?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't even read any possibility of it being taken as a statement by Solomon. The way Garrett takes it as the Shulamite, I saw another translation that suggests it was still the beloved and his friend speaking. And then, what would you see in the Shulamite as it were the day? So if it's Solomon speaking, would it be the same rhetorical point as if it were the Shulamite girl speaking? Would it be the same point? What would you see in her? I don't think it's a condemning statement from who. So let's say Solomon's speaking. If Solomon's speaking to the chorus, I don't think it's a condemnation towards them. They've already acknowledged the fact that they see her in this light now. They see her in awe. So I tend to think even if it were Solomon, I think the point would still be the same, wouldn't you? Is there any... If it were Solomon, would it change the meaning of that statement? Because I still see that there at the end of verse 13 as a rhetorical question. It points out the fact that yes, things have changed now. Thoughts or questions on that?
Wasn't that somewhat the meaning back in Genesis 32? The reason why Jacob names the village that is because he's seen the host of angels in front of him. The appearance isn't what he thinks it is. It's changed.
Yeah.
I think it's the exact same point that you're stating here.
Wow, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that, going back to why that village was named Mahanaim. That's interesting. Yeah. Hey, there we go. I think that fits perfectly. So whichever one that's speaking, whether it's the Shulamite girl or Solomon, it certainly fits that it's a rhetorical point. This is what's changed. Yeah, that's great. That's great, Joe. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Which fits right in with what you've just been
Yeah.
talking about, her change.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else through chapter 6? Okay. We'll start chapter 7. Obviously, we're not going to get very far, but the plan is to cover chapter 7 next Wednesday night, chapter 8 the next Wednesday, and then we'll get into Ecclesiastes, just so you know. And I'll have Ecclesiastes notes out on the table for next Wednesday night. Chapter 7, verse 1. How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O princess daughter. The curves of your thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of a skillful workman. Chapter 7, he's going to do the same thing that she did with him in describing him back in chapter 5. Okay, remember how the way she described him, he talked about his body like ivory and his head like gold and all this. She described him as almost like a statue. Okay, and the way she described him, it wasn't the fact that it related to any type of a physical appearance. It related to how it made her feel and how she saw him in the scheme of their relationship, not in the physical interpretation of any type of attributes. Okay, he's going to do the same thing here. All right, this is not some attempt to describe what she looks like. It's how she makes him feel. And of course, he's done this before, but now he's doing it again, and he's not repeating himself here. Even though he's done this earlier, was it back in chapter 2 or chapter 3, he did the same thing? But now they're married, and he's observing her. He's describing, and it goes from her feet up, and he describes how she makes him feel. How beautiful are your feet in sandals, O princess daughter. The curves of your thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of a skillful workman. Your navel is a rounded goblet. Of course, that term navel is the belly. It lacks no blended beverage. Your waist is a heap of wheat set about with lilies. Real romantic, right? In the language of Solomon, and especially in the language of poetry, it's describing the idea that she's pleasing to the eyes. Yes, that's part of it, but it makes him feel contented. That's why he used this phrase, a heap of wheat set about with lilies. There's this contentment that he has with her, especially when he describes the beautiful feet, the curves of her thighs. These are things that he values, that he loves about her. He says, verse 3, same thing he said earlier, your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle. Your neck is like an ivory tower. And of course, he's already mentioned that before. Your eyes like the pools of Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim. I don't know the specifics about Heshbon or the gate of Bath Rabbim, but what he describes says your eyes. Remember, before her eyes were like doves. Okay, that's how he attributed her eyes before. He's using, it's not that that's changed, but he's using a different way of describing her eyes here in verse 4. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll talk about her eyes and her nose being a tower next Wednesday night. Thank everybody for the thoughts and comments.